Rain drummed against his rusted hood. He hadn't eaten in 30 hours. Just a broke mechanic with grease tattooed into his knuckles and a 6-year-old asleep in the passenger seat. Pulling over to fix a stranded luxury sedan on a dead highway, he didn't want cash. He just wanted the untouched deli sandwich sitting on her dashboard. He had no idea the woman behind the wheel was a ruthless CEO, or that this humiliating trade would rewrite both their futures. Gravel crunched beneath the bald tires of Dean's pickup as he rolled to a stop on the shoulder of Interstate 84. The rain was coming down in relentless, blinding sheets, turning the asphalt into a slick, black mirror. He didn't want to stop. Every muscle in his back screamed in protest, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his lumbar spine all the way to the base of his skull. He was running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically. The gas gauge had been hovering over the red E for 20 miles. In the passenger seat, Sadie was a small, curled-up knot under a threadbare flannel blanket. Her chest rose and fell in the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. She hadn't complained about missing dinner, which somehow made the knot in Dean's stomach twist tighter. Through the rhythmic, squeaking sweeps of his dying windshield wipers, he saw it again. A sleek, midnight blue Mercedes S-Class pulled hazardously half onto the mud of the shoulder, hazard lights flashing a desperate, rhythmic amber into the storm. Steam hissed from beneath the hood, a ghostly plume whipped away by the wind. Dean gripped the cracked leather of his steering wheel. "Keep driving," a voice in his head urged. "You're not the AAA. You're a failing mechanic who can't even afford a value meal." But the Mercedes was positioned dangerously close to the blind curve. In this rain, a semi-truck would plow through it without even feeling the impact. Dean cursed, a sharp, bitter sound that hung in the damp air of the cab and threw the truck into park. He stepped out into the deluge. The cold water hit his face like a handful of gravel, instantly soaking his faded work shirt. The smell of ozone and wet pine needles mixed with the acrid, metallic stench of boiling coolant. As he approached the luxury vehicle, the driver's side window rolled down a fraction of an inch. A woman peered out. Her face was pale, angular, and impeccably maintained, though her dark eyes were currently wide with a mixture of annoyance and genuine fear. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Dean's entire shop. "I have roadside assistance coming," she shouted over the roar of the rain, her voice tight, clipped, defensive. They said it would be an hour. "In this storm, you'll be lucky if they find you by morning," Dean yelled back, swiping water from his eyes. "Pop the hood." She hesitated, her gaze flicking over his grease-stained jeans and soaked, heavy boots. The cynicism in her eyes was palpable. She saw a predator, or a grifter. Dean didn't blame her. He felt like a stray dog. "Pop it, lady, before a logging truck turns this German engineering into a tin can." A loud click sounded. Dean walked to the front of the car, wedging his raw, calloused fingers under the lip of the hood and throwing it open. Heat washed over him, a suffocating wave smelling of hot rubber and burnt antifreeze. He leaned in, pulling a small, heavy flashlight from his back pocket. It didn't take a genius. The upper radiator hose had slipped its clamp, probably a lazy factory install or a recent, shoddy service job. Coolant had sprayed everywhere, but the hose itself wasn't ruptured. "Keep the engine off," he yelled, leaning deep into the engine bay. The metal scorched his forearm, leaving an instant, stinging red welt. But he ignored it. He dug into his pockets, fingers brushing past 3 pennies and a crumpled receipt, until he found a heavy-duty zip tie and a multi-tool. It was a brutal, ugly fix. He shoved the thick rubber hose back onto the fitting, ignoring the scalding liquid dripping onto his knuckles, and cinched the zip tie down with the pliers until the plastic dug deep into the rubber. He slammed the hood shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot over the rain. Dean walked over to her window. She rolled it down halfway this time. The interior of the car smelled absurdly expensive. Hints of leather, sharp citrus perfume, and dry, conditioned air. "It's a temporary patch," Dean said, his voice raspy. "It'll hold long enough to get you to the city. Drive slow. Keep an eye on the temp gauge. If it creeps into the red, pull over immediately and turn the heater on full blast." The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. She reached into the center console, producing a sleek leather wallet. She pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills. They looked alien to Dean. Clean. Perfect. "Thank you," she said. It sounded practiced, transactional. Dean looked at the money. $200. It was gas. It was groceries. It was a week's worth of breathing room. He reached for it, his blackened, grease-stained fingers hovering over the green paper. But as he did, his stomach cramped violently, a sharp, twisting spasm of pure hunger. His eyes flicked past the money, landing on the passenger seat. Sitting there, wrapped in thick brown butcher paper, was a deli sandwich. A tiny corner of the paper was peeled back, revealing thick-cut turkey, sharp cheddar, and fresh lettuce. It sat on a plastic grocery bag, completely untouched. A heavy, suffocating wave of shame washed over Dean. He thought of Sadie, sleeping in the freezing truck, her stomach as empty as his. Money meant finding an open store, dragging her out in the rain, waiting. Food was right here. "I don't want your cash," Dean heard himself say. His voice sounded hollow, belonging to a stranger. The woman frowned, pulling the bills back a fraction. "Excuse me. If this is a shakedown—" "It's not a shakedown." Dean cut her off, his jaw tight. He pointed a trembling, bruised finger at the passenger seat. "Give me the sandwich." For a second, the billionaire CEO, a woman who negotiated 9-figure acquisitions before breakfast, just blinked. Complete, unadulterated confusion stripped the cold veneer from her face. My lunch? Yeah." Dean swallowed hard, the taste of pride turning to ash in his mouth. "The sandwich. Hand it over, and we're square." She looked at him, really looked at him this time. She saw the sunken hollows of his cheeks, the dark, bruise-like circles under his eyes, the desperate, rigid set of his shoulders. She picked up the wrapped sandwich, holding it out through the window. Our fingers brushed. Hers were smooth, ice-cold, manicured. His were rough as sandpaper, radiating a feverish heat. Dean snatched it, turning on his heel without another word. He didn't look back as he marched to his truck, the rain instantly turning the butcher paper soggy. He climbed into the cab, slamming the heavy metal door, shutting out the storm. Sadie stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" "Hey, bug," Dean whispered, his voice cracking. He broke the sandwich in half. He handed the larger piece to his daughter. "Look what I found," as Sadie tore into the food with a terrifying, silent urgency. Dean sat in the driver's seat, holding his half. He stared through the rear-view mirror as the Mercedes pulled slowly away into the night. He didn't eat. He just sat there, the smell of roasted turkey and damp paper filling the cab, crying silent, bitter tears into his dirty hands. Claire stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office, staring down at the grid of city lights bleeding through the morning fog. 90 stories up, the world looked organized, predictable. It was a massive chessboard of steel and glass, and she owned a significant portion of the pieces. She took a sip of her black espresso. It was bitter, imported, and perfect. Yet it tasted like ash on her tongue. "The restructuring for the logistics division is finalized, Claire," Greg, her chief of operations, said from the long mahogany conference table behind her. We're trimming 14% of the workforce. It's aggressive, but the board will love the margin improvements." "Fine," Claire said, not turning around. "Are you looking at the projections?" Greg asked, a hint of hesitation in his usually confident voice. No, she wasn't looking at anything. For the past 48 hours, ever since she limped her Mercedes into the city, her mind had been trapped in a loop, snagging on a single, jarring memory. "Give me the sandwich." People wanted things from Claire. Always. They wanted her money, her influence, her equity, her endorsement. They smiled with perfectly capped teeth and negotiated with ruthless, polished charm. But the man in the rain, he had looked at her $200 with a mix of longing and disgust, and chosen a $12 turkey club instead. She closed her eyes, and the sensory details rushed back, uninvited. The smell of his wet, rusted clothes, the searing heat coming off his skin when their hands accidentally brushed, the horrifying realization that he hadn't asked for the food for himself. She had seen the silhouette of a child in the passenger seat of his decaying truck as she drove away. It was a crack in her perfectly curated reality. It bothered her. It felt like a loose thread on a bespoke suit. If she didn't pull it, it would drive her mad. "Greg," Claire said, turning around. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood. "The plates on the truck that stopped to help me on Tuesday night. Did you run them?" Greg blinked, adjusting his glasses. "I did. I assumed you wanted to send him a check or something. I have the file right here." He pushed a manila folder across the table. Claire walked over, opening it. Dean Horace. 34. Widowed 3 years ago. Cancer, a drawn-out, expensive battle. Owner of a small, independent auto repair shop on the industrial outskirts of the city. She flipped the page. The financial history was a slaughterhouse. Maxed-out credit cards. 2 remortgages on the shop. A mountain of medical debt that had long since been sold to predatory collection agencies. And at the very bottom, a foreclosure notice on the commercial property, effective at the end of the month. 3 days from now. "He's drowning," Claire murmured, tracing the edge of the paper with a manicured fingernail. "He's statistically irrelevant," Greg corrected gently. "Small businesses fail every day, Claire. It's the cycle of the market. You want me to send a messenger with a few grand? Anonymously? Clean your conscience?" Claire looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Greg with a sudden, chilling intensity. "My conscience is perfectly clean, Greg. I don't operate on pity." She closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Cancel my afternoon meetings." Meanwhile, across the city, Dean was lying on a cold, oil-stained creeper beneath the rusted underbelly of a 2008 Honda Civic. A drop of dirty motor oil fell, hitting him squarely on the cheek. He didn't flinch. He just wiped it away with the back of a gloved hand, smearing a black streak across his stubble, and kept wrenching the seized bolt on the exhaust manifold. The shop was freezing. He couldn't afford to run the space heater today. The air smelled of stale tobacco, brake cleaner, and impending defeat. "Daddy, I drew a car," Sadie's voice echoed from the small, cluttered office at the front of the garage. Dean slid out from under the Honda, his joints popping like firecrackers. He forced a smile, though it felt tight and unconvincing on his face. He walked over to the office door, leaning against the doorframe. Sadie was sitting on a milk crate, using his scarred metal desk as an easel. She held up a piece of printer paper. It was a messy crayon rendering of a blue car. "It's the fancy lady's car," Sadie announced proudly. "The one from the rain." Dean felt a muscle feather in his jaw. "It's a good drawing, Bug. Very accurate." He looked away, staring out the dirty, frosted windows of the garage doors. The foreclosure notice was taped to the glass, blocking the weak afternoon sunlight. 3 days. He had 3 days to pack up 10 years of his life, his tools, his late wife's memories that seemed baked into the very concrete of this place, and get out. He had no apartment lined up, no savings. He was going to have to move Sadie into a residential motel, assuming he could pawn his heavy air compressor for enough cash. The bell above the shop's side door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. Dean wiped his hands on a greasy red rag. "Stay here, Sadie. Draw me a truck next." He stepped out into the main bay, expecting a debt collector, or maybe a customer looking for a cheap inspection sticker. Instead, standing in the middle of his filthy, failing garage, was the woman from the storm. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat, pristine against the grim backdrop of tools and tires. She looked around, her eyes taking in the peeling paint, the empty bays, the sheer desperation radiating from the walls. She wasn't holding a sandwich this time. She was holding a sleek leather briefcase. Dean froze. The rag in his hands suddenly felt very heavy. The shame from the highway, the memory of begging for her leftover food, rushed back, burning the back of his neck. "We're closed," Dean said roughly, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Claire turned to look at him. She didn't flinch at his tone. "The sign outside says you're open until 6. The sign is a liar. What do you want?" Dean closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. He wanted her out. Her presence here was an intrusion. It felt like she was standing in his bedroom, looking through his dirty laundry. "I came to pay a debt," Claire said, her voice smooth, controlled. "You don't owe me anything. I fixed your hose. You gave me—" He couldn't say it. He swallowed the word. "We're square. Leave." Claire didn't move. She stepped closer, invading his space. She didn't seem to care that his clothes were covered in carcinogenic grime. "I don't leave loose ends, Mr. Horace," she said quietly. "You traded highly specialized labor for a depreciating asset, a turkey sandwich. From a purely economic standpoint, you operated at a massive loss. I don't like being on the winning side of an unfair trade. It makes me feel indebted." Dean let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Indebted? Lady, I'm getting evicted in 3 days. I don't give a damn about your corporate guilt. Go buy a yacht. Go fire someone. Just get out of my shop." The air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, volatile electricity. The scent of Claire's expensive perfume warred with the heavy, masculine smell of aerosol lubricant and old sweat. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the flash of anger in his. Most men in her world folded when she applied pressure. They capitulated, smiled, and asked for a stock tip. Dean Harris was standing his ground, a cornered animal baring its teeth. It was terrifying and entirely fascinating. "I didn't come here to apologize, Dean," Claire said, dropping the formal address. "And I certainly didn't come here out of guilt. I came here for an acquisition." Dean stared at her, utterly bewildered. He tossed the greasy red rag onto a nearby workbench. "An acquisition? Are you insane? Look around. I don't own the building anymore. The bank does. My tools are heavily depreciated. I have zero inventory. You want to acquire my debt?" "I already did," Claire said. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet in the corner of the bay. Dean felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. "What did you just say?" Claire opened the leather briefcase resting on her forearm. She pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents, holding them out to him. "I bought the commercial note from First National. I also purchased your outstanding medical debt from the collection agencies. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Dean, I own this building. And technically, you owe me roughly $240,000. Dean didn't take the papers. He felt a sudden, violent urge to grab her by the shoulders and throw her out into the street. His hands actually shook with the effort of keeping them at his sides. The sheer arrogance of it. the invasive, godlike meddling in his miserable private life. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so deep it made his chest ache. "You think because you have money, you can just buy a person? Treat my life like a side project?" "I don't do side projects," Claire replied, her voice remaining impossibly steady, though a faint flush had crept into her pale cheeks. She was pushing him, testing the structural integrity of his pride. "I operate a logistics network with over 4,000 commercial vehicles on the eastern seaboard. My current fleet management firm is overcharging me by 22% and falsifying maintenance logs. It's costing me millions in downtime." She took a step closer. She was looking up at him now, her dark eyes entirely devoid of pity. There was only calculation. "I need a fleet manager. Someone who understands mechanics on a granular level. Someone who is too painfully, stubbornly proud to steal from me. Someone who will pull over in a monsoon to fix a stranger's car for absolutely nothing." Dean's breathing was heavy, ragged. He looked at the paperwork in her hand, then back up to her face. "So you manufacture a crisis. You buy my debt so I have a gun to my head. So I have to work for you." "You already had a gun to your head, Dean," Claire said softly, the harshness finally bleeding out of her tone, revealing something raw beneath. "I just changed the person holding it, and I'm offering to put it down." She placed the documents on the hood of a nearby car. "The salary is $150,000 a year, plus full benefits. Medical, dental, and a comprehensive education trust for your daughter." She paused, her eyes flickering toward the office door where Sadie was quietly coloring. "The debt is forgiven the moment you sign the employment contract. This shop becomes a regional maintenance hub. You run it your way. You hire who you want." Dean felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. He gripped the edge of a steel workbench to steady himself. This wasn't real. It was a hallucination brought on by starvation and stress. People didn't swoop down from glass towers to save failing mechanics. The world didn't work like that. The world ground you down until there was nothing left but dust and past due notices. "Why?" Dean asked, his voice cracking. He hated how vulnerable he sounded. "You could hire a dozen corporate guys to do this. Why me?" Claire looked away for the first time. She looked at the grease stains on the concrete floor, her perfectly manicured hands tightening around the handle of her empty briefcase. "Because," she started, her voice quieter now, lacking its usual boardroom acoustics. "I spend every day surrounded by people who would sell their own mothers for a fractional share of stock. I swim in a tank full of predators who wear silk ties. 2 nights ago, I offered a desperate, starving man cash. He refused it, because his daughter was hungry and he couldn't wait. He sacrificed his dignity for a piece of bread." She looked back at him, her eyes shining with an emotion Dean couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It was almost envy. "You have something I lost a very long time ago, Dean. You have a reason to fight that isn't just money. I need that energy in my company. I need someone who knows what it costs to survive." Dean stared at the contract resting on the hood of the car. The white paper looked painfully bright in the dim, dirty garage. He thought about the residential motel. He thought about the way Sadie had looked when she ate that sandwich, the desperate, animalistic hunger in her small eyes. He thought about the crushing weight on his chest that had been suffocating him for 3 years. He looked at his hands, blackened, calloused, scarred. They were the hands of a man who fixed broken things. Could he fix his own life if he let this cold, alien woman hand him the tools? Dean walked slowly toward the car. He didn't look at Claire. He reached out, his greasy fingers leaving a slight, dark smudge on the pristine white edge of the contract. "I don't wear suits," he rasped, his eyes scanning the dense legal text without really reading it. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile broke the severe line of her lips. I don't care if you wear a burlap sack, Dean, as long as my trucks stay on the road. Dean picked up a cheap, blue plastic pen from a nearby diagnostic cart. It was covered in oil and had teeth marks on the cap. He clicked it. The sound was loud, decisive in the quiet shop. He didn't know if he was signing a salvation pact or a deal with the devil. He only knew that for the first time in 3 years, he could see a future that didn't end in ruin. He pressed the pen to the paper. The transition was not a cinematic montage of handshakes and sudden success. It felt more like a skin graft, painful, itchy, and constantly threatening to reject the host. Dean kept his shop. Claire's money had cleared the bank, scrubbing his debts with the cold efficiency of bleach, but the physical space remained his domain. The peeling paint stayed. The battered steel desk stayed. The only difference was the fleet of massive white commercial delivery trucks that began choking his dirt lot, waiting for triage. And the suits. They started showing up on day 3. Mid-level managers from Claire's corporate headquarters sent down to integrate Dean into their operational matrix. They walked into his garage like they were touring a hazardous waste facility, pinching the creases of their trousers and breathing through their mouths. Greg was the worst of them. Greg was Claire's chief of operations. He wore ties that cost more than a set of premium brake pads, and he looked at Dean the way a man looks at a cockroach in his kitchen, something to be swiftly and violently eradicated. "The reporting structure is quite simple, Harris," Greg said on a humid Tuesday morning, dropping a thick, glossy binder onto Dean's workbench. It landed directly on a disassembled carburetor, knocking a crucial spring into the grime below. You log the maintenance hours in the proprietary software. You do not authorize overtime. You do not order parts outside of our approved vendor network. Dean slowly picked up the binder. He didn't open it. He just stared at the greasy smudge it had left on his bench. The air in the shop was heavy, smelling of raw gasoline and impending summer heat. "Your approved vendor network is garbage," Dean said, his voice flat. He wiped his hands on a rag, the coarse fabric scraping against his calluses. "You're buying remanufactured brake calipers from a supplier in Ohio. They use cheap rubber seals. In stop-and-go city traffic, those seals dry rot in 6 months. That's why 3 of your trucks are sitting in my lot right now with blown lines." Greg offered a tight, patronizing smile. "The supplier in Ohio provides a 30% discount on bulk orders. The margins are calculated, Harris. You turn wrenches. Let us handle the economics." Dean felt a muscle jump in his jaw. The instinct to grab Greg by his expensive lapels and drag him out to the pavement was overwhelming. It burned in his chest, a hot, primitive urge. But he thought of Sadie. He thought of the medical debt that no longer hovered over him like a guillotine. He swallowed the bile in his throat. "Calculated margins don't stop a 10-ton truck when a kid runs into the street," Dean said, dropping the binder into a nearby trash can. It hit the bottom with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Tell your boss I'm ordering OEM parts. If she has a problem with it, she knows where to find me." Greg's smile vanished, replaced by a thin, bloodless line. "You're a charity case, Harris. Claire has a habit of picking up strays, but she gets bored easily. Don't mistake a temporary lifeline for job security." Greg turned and walked out, his leather soles clicking sharply against the concrete. Dean stood alone in the quiet shop. The smell of gas was making his head ache. He walked over to the nearest truck, a massive box van with a shattered side mirror and a groaning transmission. He laid his hand on the warm metal hood. This he understood. Broken metal, stripped gears, pressurized fluids. These things made sense. They didn't lie to your face while shaking your hand. He spent the next 14 hours buried in the underbelly of the fleet. He cross-referenced the physical condition of the trucks with the digital maintenance logs Claire's company had provided. By 2 a.m., the shop was dead silent, save for the hum of the ancient refrigerator in the corner. Dean sat at his desk, staring at a glowing laptop screen, his eyes burning with fatigue. The logs were a fiction, a massive, deliberate lie. Trucks that had supposedly received full brake overhauls a month ago were riding on metal-to-metal rotors. Oil changes billed at premium synthetic rates had been done with cheap, recycled sludge. The previous fleet management company hadn't just been overcharging Claire, they had been actively gutting her assets to pad their invoices, and they couldn't have done it without someone inside Claire's company signing off on the fraudulent inspections. Someone high up. Dean printed the damning spreadsheets. The printer screamed in protest, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. He gathered the warm papers, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't the caffeine. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that the woman who had bought his life was being bled dry by her own people. The corporate headquarters of Apex Logistics was a towering monument of glass and steel in the center of the financial district. Dean had never been inside. He hated the city center. It smelled of hot exhaust, sanitized air, and anxiety. He walked through the revolving doors at 7 a.m., wearing clean, stiff jeans and a black button-down shirt that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old oil. The lobby was a vast, echoing cavern of white marble. The security guard at the desk eyed him with immediate suspicion. "I need to see Claire," Dean said, slapping his greasy plastic access badge on the scanner. The guard frowned. "Ms. CEO? Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No. Tell her Dean Harris is here. Tell her it's about the Ohio vendor." 10 minutes later, Dean was in an elevator, shooting up to the 90th floor. His ears popped. His stomach dropped. The sheer altitude felt unnatural. The doors slid open to a floor that was entirely silent. Thick, plush carpet absorbed the sound of his heavy boots. He found Claire in her corner office. The walls were all glass, offering a dizzying view of the city waking up below. She was standing by the window, a phone pressed to her ear, looking immaculate in a sharp navy suit. She hung up as he walked in, her dark eyes registering a flicker of surprise before smoothing into her standard, unreadable mask. "Dean, it's early. I wasn't aware we had a meeting." "We don't," Dean said, walking over to her massive glass desk. He dropped the stack of printed spreadsheets right in the center of it. "You're being robbed?" Claire didn't immediately reach for the papers. She looked at his face. The dark circles under his eyes were back. He looked wild, sleep-deprived, and utterly furious. "Explain," she said, her voice quiet. "The fleet logs are fabricated," Dean said, leaning his knuckles on her desk. "Your previous management company was billing you for phantom maintenance, but they were doing it so systematically that it had to be an inside job. Someone in this building has been approving the purchase orders and signing off on the visual inspections." Claire finally looked down at the papers. She picked up a silver pen, using it to trace the columns of data Dean had highlighted in aggressive yellow marker. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Dean watched her. He expected shock. He expected panic. Instead, Claire's face turned into stone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The Ohio vendor," Claire murmured, not looking up. "Greg pushed aggressively for that contract last quarter. Greg is the one signing the approvals," Dean confirmed, a dark satisfaction blooming in his chest. "I pulled the authorization codes from the system. It's his digital signature on every fraudulent invoice for the past 18 months. He's skimming millions, Claire, and he's putting your drivers in death traps to do it." Claire slowly set the pen down. She walked over to a small, hidden cabinet, integrated into the wall, and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter. She poured a short measure of amber liquid into a glass, offering it to him. Dean shook his head. "I don't drink." Claire took a sip herself, her eyes fixed on the city below. "Greg has been with me since I took this company over from my father. He knows where the bodies are buried, Dean. If I move against him without an airtight case, he'll burn this division to the ground." "The case is on your desk," Dean argued, gesturing to the papers. "This proves negligence," Claire countered sharply, turning to face him. "It doesn't prove criminal intent. A defense lawyer will say he was overworked and rubber-stamped the approvals. I need a paper trail connecting him directly to the kickbacks from the vendor." Dean dragged a hand down his face, the stubble rasping loudly in the quiet room. He felt out of his depth. He was used to replacing broken parts, not navigating corporate espionage. So what do we do? Let him keep putting my guys in trucks with failing brakes? "No," Claire said softly. She walked back to her desk, leaning against the edge, suddenly much closer to him. He could smell that sharp, citrus perfume again. It mixed with the sterile smell of the office, creating something entirely intoxicating. "You ground every truck that isn't safe. You refuse to sign them out. You create a bottleneck," she instructed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Force Greg to come to you. Make him desperate. When people are desperate, they make mistakes." Dean looked at her. Really looked at her. Beneath the expensive clothes and the icy exterior, he saw it again. The ruthless, calculating predator. But this time she wasn't hunting him. She was inviting him to hunt alongside her. "And if he comes after me?" Dean asked. Claire's eyes locked onto his. There was a sudden, fierce protectiveness in her gaze that caught him completely off guard. "He won't," she said. "I bought your debt, Dean. But I also bought your problems. You're mine to protect now." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with an intimacy that neither of them was prepared to acknowledge. Dean stepped back, breaking the invisible tether between them. "I'll ground the trucks," he muttered, turning toward the door. "Dean!" Claire called out before he reached the exit. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. It didn't sound practiced or transactional this time. It sounded painfully real. The bottleneck worked too well. Within 4 days, Dean had grounded 42% of the regional fleet. His lot looked like a truck graveyard. The loading docks at the distribution centers were stacked with rotting, perishable goods. The supply chain was seizing up, choking on its own delayed deliveries. Dean was in the pit, covered in grease, torquing a drive shaft on a box truck, when the screaming started. "Harris, get out here!" Dean slid out from under the chassis, wiping his hands on his coveralls. Greg was standing in the center of the garage, flanked by 2 burly men in cheap suits who looked less like corporate managers and more like private security. Greg's face was purple with rage. The polished veneer was entirely gone, replaced by naked panic. "You are single-handedly destroying our quarterly projections," Greg screamed, his voice cracking. "I want these trucks on the road in 1 hour, or you are terminated. Contract be damned." Dean slowly stood up to his full height. He was an inch taller than Greg, and a lot wider across the shoulders. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the executive, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. "Did you hear me, you grease monkey?" Greg stepped forward, jabbing a finger into Dean's chest. It was a fatal mistake. Dean didn't punch him. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached out with a hand, calloused from years of gripping wrenches, grabbed Greg's extended finger, and squeezed, just enough to let him know he could snap it like a dry twig. Greg gasped, his knees buckling slightly as the pain shot up his arm. The 2 security men stepped forward, but Dean's dead-eyed stare stopped them in their tracks. "Do not ever touch me," Dean whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the concrete walls. "And do not ever come into my shop and tell me to put a dangerous vehicle on the public roads." He let go of the finger. Greg stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. "You're done, Harris," Greg spat, his voice trembling. "You think Claire actually cares about you? You're a pet, a little charity project. I looked into your background, Dean. I know about the bankruptcy. I know about the medical debt. I know you were living out of your truck with your kid." Dean froze. The words hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. "Claire didn't hire you because you're a good mechanic," Greg sneered, smelling blood in the water. "She hired you because you were pathetic. It was a power trip. And now you've outlived your usefulness." Greg turned and stormed out, his goons trailing behind him. Dean stood completely still in the center of the garage. The silence rushed back in, deafening. Pathetic. A charity project. The words echoed in his skull, digging into his deepest, darkest insecurities. The shame he had felt on the highway that night, the shame of begging for a sandwich, roared back to life, suffocating him. He had let himself believe he was earning his keep. He had let himself believe this was a partnership. But Greg was right. He was just a pawn in a billionaire's game of corporate chess. Dean walked over to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a duffel bag. He started throwing his personal tools into it. Heavy wrenches clanged against ratchets. He didn't care. He was done. He wasn't going to be anyone's pet. "Daddy?" Dean stopped. Sadie was standing in the doorway of the office, holding a half-eaten apple. She looked at the duffel bag, her small face scrunching up in confusion. "Are we leaving?" she asked softly. Dean felt his heart shatter. He looked at his daughter, her clothes clean, her stomach full, the color finally back in her cheeks. He was about to rip her away from the first stability she had known in years, all because of his own brittle pride. Before he could answer, the bell above the side door chimed. Dean turned, expecting Greg to have returned with the police. Instead, Claire walked in. She wasn't wearing a suit today. She was wearing dark jeans and a simple black sweater. She looked out of place, yet somehow completely commanding. She took one look at the duffel bag on the desk, and then at Dean's rigid posture. "I heard about the altercation," Claire said, her voice tight. She walked across the oily floor, ignoring the grime. "Greg just called security, trying to have you barred from the premises." "Save it," Dean said harshly, zipping up the bag with a violent yank. "He already fired me, and you know what? He's right. I don't belong here. I don't play these games." Claire stopped a few feet away from him. She looked at Sadie, offering the girl a small, surprisingly warm smile, before turning her full attention back to Dean. "He doesn't have the authority to fire you," Claire said quietly. "And he knows it. He's panicking because your bottleneck worked. 5 minutes ago, my forensic accountants found an offshore shell company tied to Greg's brother. It's the same company receiving the kickbacks from the Ohio vendor." Dean stopped. He looked at her, his hand still gripping the straps of the duffel bag. "It's over, Dean," Claire said, taking a step closer. Her dark eyes were intense, searching his face. "I'm terminating Greg today. I'm turning the files over to the district attorney." "Congratulations," Dean said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You won. The chess piece did its job. Now let me go." Claire flinched. It was a tiny, microscopic movement, but Dean caught it. The icy facade cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. "Is that what you think this is?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the grease on his clothes, and reached out. She placed her hand over his on the handle of the duffel bag. Her skin was warm this time. "I didn't buy your debt to own you, Dean," she said, looking up into his eyes. "I bought it so you would have the freedom to fight back. Because I couldn't do this alone. I am surrounded by people who lie to me every second of every day. You are the only person who looked me in the eye and told me the truth, even when it cost you everything." Dean looked down at her hand, covering his. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity up his arm. He looked at the exhaustion in her eyes, the heavy burden of her empire weighing down her shoulders. She wasn't an untouchable billionaire right now. She was just a woman, standing in a dirty garage, asking him to stay. "Don't run away," Claire whispered. "I need you to fix this." Dean slowly released his grip on the bag. He let it drop back onto the desk with a heavy thud. He looked at Sadie, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. Then he looked back at Claire. "Fine," Dean muttered, his voice rough. "But I'm picking the new brake vendor." A genuine, brilliant smile broke across Claire's face. It changed her entirely, wiping away the coldness and leaving something breathtaking in its wake. "Deal," she said. Greg did not go quietly. He screamed. He threatened lawsuits. He hurled a heavy marble paperweight across Claire's corner office, shattering a $1,000 architectural model before building security physically dragged him into the elevator. Down in the grime of the industrial district, Dean felt the shockwaves of the termination. It wasn't a sudden, peaceful transition. It was an operational bloodbath. Greg had loyalists, dispatchers, mid-level accountants, and regional managers who had all been taking a slice of the kickback pie. Claire fired them all in a single, brutal Tuesday afternoon. The immediate result was total chaos. For 3 weeks, Dean barely slept. He lived on black coffee that tasted like battery acid and adrenaline that made his hands shake. Apex Logistics had a fleet of 4,000 trucks, and suddenly, the digital infrastructure holding them together was gone. They had to revert to analog. Whiteboards, dry erase markers, and carbon copy invoices completely covered the walls of Dean's small, drafty office. He was no longer just turning wrenches. He was directing a massive, bleeding mechanical army. Truck 419 is throwing a code for a clogged DPF filter, a young, exhausted driver said, leaning through the open window of Dean's office. It was raining again, a cold, miserable autumn drizzle. "Dispatch says I have to run the route anyway." "Dispatch is wrong," Dean barked, not looking up from the spread of schematics on his desk. He grabbed a red marker, striking a brutal line through a printed schedule. "If you force a region on that engine with a clogged filter, you'll melt the manifold. Ground it. Take the spare box truck in Bay 3. The keys are in the ignition." The driver nodded, vanishing into the damp grey morning. Dean rubbed his face, feeling the heavy sandpaper grit of a 3-day beard. His back ached with a deep, persistent throb. He smelled like diesel exhaust and stale sweat. The side door chimed. Dean didn't turn around. "I said grab the keys from Bay 3, kid. I'm busy. I don't think I can reach the pedals in a box truck, Dean." He froze. The voice was smooth, carrying that familiar, quiet authority. He turned in his swivel chair, the ancient springs screaming in protest. Claire stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore dark, heavy denim, a thick woolen sweater, and boots that actually looked capable of surviving a puddle. She held a large, brown paper bag that radiated an intense, savory heat. "You haven't answered your phone in 2 days, Claire said, stepping into the cramped office. She looked around at the chaotic explosion of paperwork, the overflowing trash cans, and the cot in the corner where Sadie usually slept when the babysitter couldn't make it. "I've been a little preoccupied keeping your company from bleeding out," Dean said, his voice raspy. He couldn't help the defensive edge that crept into his tone. He felt exposed. The office was a disaster. He was a disaster. Claire didn't flinch. She set the brown bag down right in the center of his schematics. "Move the papers. Those are the routing logs for the eastern seaboard." "Move them, Dean, or they're going to smell like pastrami." Dean stared at her for a long second, his jaw tightening, before he finally relented. He shoved the paperwork aside. Claire reached into the bag and pulled out 2 massive deli sandwiches wrapped in foil, placing them on the cleared metal surface. Then she pulled out 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. "I remember you prefer a turkey club," Claire said quietly, her eyes locking onto his. "But this place only had hot pastrami. I hope your pride can handle the substitution." The memory of the rain-slicked highway flashed between them, a heavy, unspoken ghost. Dean felt a sudden, sharp tightness in his throat. He looked down at the foil-wrapped sandwich. The steam rising from it smelled like salt, melted cheese, and survival. "You didn't have to drive all the way down here for this," Dean muttered, unwrapping his half. The aluminum crinkled loudly. "I didn't come here to deliver lunch," Claire said. She sat down on the overturned milk crate Sadie usually used as a stool, completely ignoring the thin layer of grease coating the plastic. "I came here because the 90th floor is entirely empty. Everyone is terrified of me. They think I'm going to fire them next." Dean took a massive bite of the sandwich. The rich, salty fat coated his tongue. It was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. He chewed, swallowing hard. "Are you?" "Probably," Claire admitted, staring down at her own untouched food. The fluorescent lighting above cast harsh shadows across her cheekbones. She looked brittle. The untouchable armor was cracking, revealing a profound, isolating exhaustion. "The rot went deeper than Greg. My father built this company on handshakes and loyalty. I inherited a snake pit. I spent 12 hours a day looking at spreadsheets, trying to figure out who is lying to me." She looked up, her dark eyes finding his. "This garage," she whispered, gesturing to the cinder block walls, "is the only place in the entire city where I know exactly what I'm dealing with." Dean stopped chewing. The raw vulnerability in her voice hit him like a physical blow. He was so used to seeing her as a force of nature, a billionaire who could rewrite his life with a stroke of a pen. He hadn't realized that her money was just a different kind of prison. "Well," Dean said slowly, his voice softening, "the coffee here is terrible. And the company is worse." A small, genuine laugh escaped Claire's lips. It was a startling sound, bright and unexpected in the grim space. "I'll take terrible coffee over vintage scotch with thieves, Dean." They ate in silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom, nor the awkward tension of their first meeting. It was the companionable quiet of 2 people in a trench, taking a momentary breath while the artillery fired overhead. Winter arrived not with a gentle frost, but with a violent, howling blizzard that paralyzed the entire eastern seaboard. The temperature plummeted to 14 degrees below zero. Ice coated the power lines, snapping them like dry spaghetti. The city ground to a brutal halt, but logistics didn't sleep. The hospital still needed medical oxygen. The regional grocery hubs still needed perishable staging. Dean was under a cab-over engine in Bay 2, wrestling with a frozen air brake line, when the emergency radio on his desk crackled to life. "Base, this is Unit 412. I'm jackknifed on Route 9, mile marker 18. I've lost all air pressure. My trailer is completely blocking the northbound lanes." Dean slid out on his creeper, wiping his frozen, greasy hands on a rag. He keyed the mic. "Unit 412, are you carrying the generator units for Mercy General?" "Affirmative. Base. And the state troopers are threatening to push my rig into the ditch with a snowplow if I can't move it in 20 minutes to clear the way for emergency vehicles." Dean cursed violently. If the troopers pushed the trailer into the ditch, it would roll. Millions of dollars of critical infrastructure, equipment keeping patients alive, would be destroyed in a heartbeat. He didn't think. He just moved. He grabbed his heavy winter parka off the hook, the thick canvas stiff with old oil. He shoved a portable air compressor, 3 heavy-duty pneumatic hoses, and a blowtorch into a steel toolbox. "Where are you going?" Dean spun around. Claire was standing in the doorway connecting the office to the bay. She had been there for hours, auditing manifests on his laptop while the storm raged outside. "Route 9, Dean grunted, hauling the 80-pound toolbox toward his personal heavy-duty tow truck parked near the bay doors. "One of your drivers jackknifed. He lost his air brakes. If I don't go unfreeze his lines and manually pump his tanks, the state police are going to destroy the payload." "I'm coming with you," Claire said instantly, slamming the laptop shut. "No, you're not," Dean barked, throwing the toolbox into the bed of the truck. The metal clanged sharply over the howling wind outside. "It's a whiteout. It's 14 below. You're wearing Italian leather boots, Claire. You'll lose your toes." "It's my payload," she fired back, her voice cutting through the garage with absolute authority. "And it's my driver freezing on the highway. I don't hide in offices while my people take the risks. I'm going." Dean looked at the stubborn, fierce set of her jaw. There was no arguing with her. He didn't have the time to try. "Fine, get in. But if you complain about the cold, I'm leaving you on the shoulder." The ride was a nightmare. The heater in Dean's truck was essentially a rumor. The cab was freezing, the windshield constantly threatening to ice over, despite the defroster blowing full blast. The roads were treacherous, a slick sheet of black ice, buried beneath 3 inches of drifting snow. The tires fought for grip every time Dean touched the throttle. Claire sat in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle until her knuckles turned white. She didn't say a word. She didn't complain. She just watched Dean navigate the deadly terrain, her eyes tracking the precise, calculated movements of his hands on the steering wheel. He drove not with panic, but with a cold, mechanical aggression. He understood the machine beneath him, and he bullied it into submission. They found the jackknifed rig 20 minutes later. It was a massive, terrifying wall of white metal blocking the highway. The red and blue lights of a state trooper's cruiser cut through the blinding snow, casting an eerie, strobe light effect over the scene. Dean threw his truck into park and grabbed his toolbox. The wind hit them like a physical wall the second they opened the doors. It stole the breath from Dean's lungs, carrying shards of ice that bit into his exposed face. He ran to the side of the trailer, dropping to his knees in the deep, freezing slush. The airlines were completely encased in a block of solid ice. Moisture had built up in the system and frozen solid, locking the brakes in place. "Hold this!" Dean yelled over the screaming wind, shoving a heavy cast-iron flashlight into Claire's hands as she crouched beside him. She didn't hesitate. She gripped the icy metal, directing the beam directly onto the frozen valves. Her expensive coat was instantly soaked in dirty, freezing road slush. Her hair whipped violently across her face. Dean ignited the blowtorch. The blue flame roared, barely audible over the storm. He carefully applied heat to the brass fittings, his bare hands working inches away from the scorching metal. He couldn't wear gloves. He needed to feel the release valve. "Keep the light steady," he barked. "I'm trying!" Claire yelled back, her teeth chattering so violently Dean could hear them. Her hands were shaking, but she forced the beam of light to remain locked on the valve. It took 10 agonizing minutes. The brass heated, hissed, and finally, with a loud, violent crack, the ice shattered. Compressed air hissed aggressively from the lines. "Got it!" Dean shouted, hooking up his portable compressor to the trailer's emergency supply line. The heavy diesel engine of the compressor coughed to life, pumping hot air into the truck's frozen system. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive brake pods retracted. The truck was free. Dean fell back into the snow, his chest heaving, his hands raw and blistered from the cold and the heat of the torch. He looked over at Claire. She was kneeling in a puddle of freezing antifreeze and melted snow. Her makeup was smeared. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. She looked entirely ruined, and as she looked back at him, her eyes wide with the sheer adrenaline of the save, a massive, uninhibited grin broke across her face. It wasn't a polite, corporate smile. It was a feral, victorious grin. Dean stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, suddenly entirely unaware of the freezing wind. He realized, in that chaotic, freezing moment, that the billionaire CEO he had resented so deeply was gone. In her place was a woman made of pure grit. "Let's get back to the shop," Dean said, his voice surprisingly thick. "Before you freeze to death." The garage was quiet. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, muffled silence that settled over the city. Inside the office, the ancient space heater glowed a vibrant, angry orange. Dean sat on the edge of his scarred metal desk. Claire was huddled in his swivel chair, wrapped in his heavy, oil-stained parka. Her wet coat was hanging over a chair to dry. She held a mug of black tea, her fingers still slightly pale, absorbing the heat radiating through the ceramic. Sadie was sound asleep on the small cot in the corner, a heavy woolen blanket tucked up to her chin. The rhythmic sound of her breathing anchored the room. The adrenaline had finally burned off, leaving behind a heavy, aching exhaustion. Dean watched Claire take a slow sip of the tea. The harsh lines of stress that usually framed her face were completely gone, softened by the fatigue and the residual cold. She looked younger. She looked human. "You ruined a $3,000 coat today," Dean noted, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Claire looked down at the dark stains on her jeans, then over to the ruined cashmere hanging nearby. She offered a tired, dismissive shrug. "It was just fabric. The payload was worth $2 million, and the hospital needed it. We made a good trade." She looked up at him. "You're a good mechanic, Dean, and you're not terrible with a flashlight," he replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The silence stretched between them again. But the friction was gone. The heavy, invisible walls of class, of wealth, of employer and employee, they had melted away somewhere on that frozen highway. They were just two people sitting in a warm room, hiding from the cold. Claire set her mug down on the desk. She stood up, the oversized parka swallowing her frame. She walked slowly toward Dean, stopping just inches away from where he sat on the edge of the desk. She reached out, her small, cold hand gently taking his right hand. Dean stiffened slightly, but he didn't pull away. She turned his hand over, tracing the angry red blisters along his knuckles where the blowtorch had singed his skin. Her touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the rough calluses covering his palms. "You bleed for this company," Claire whispered, her eyes fixed on his battered hand. "You didn't have to go out there today. You could have let the state troopers handle it. You could have let me take the loss. I don't let things stay broken if I can fix them," Dean said quietly, his gaze dropping to the top of her head. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of ozone and the sharp citrus of her perfume, entirely masking the smell of the garage. "I know," Claire said. She finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. The vulnerability in her gaze was absolute. There was no calculation, no corporate armor. "But who fixes you, Dean? When you're running on empty? When you're freezing in a truck trying to keep everything together?" Dean felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He thought of the 3 years of grinding, crushing loneliness since his wife died, the terrifying nights wondering how he was going to feed Sadie, the absolute certainty that the world was designed to crush him. He had fought so hard to survive that he had forgotten how to live. "I don't know," Dean admitted, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "I guess I haven't figured that part out yet." Claire stepped closer, sliding into the small space between his knees as he sat on the desk. The proximity was electric. It sent a heavy, pulsing heat straight into Dean's chest. She reached up, her cold fingers gently brushing against the harsh stubble on his jawline. "Let me try," she whispered. She didn't wait for an answer. Claire closed the final inch between them, pressing her lips against his. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was desperate. It tasted like cold tea, adrenaline, and undeniable relief. Dean froze for a fraction of a second, his brain short-circuiting, before instinct took over. He reached up, his large, calloused hands cupping her face, pulling her closer. He kissed her back with a fierce, possessive hunger, pouring 3 years of suppressed anger, fear, and profound loneliness into the contact. Claire let out a soft, shuddering breath, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, as if he were the only solid thing in a world made of ice. They finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against one another. The ancient space heater clicked and hummed. The faint sound of the wind rattled the frosted glass of the garage doors. Dean looked down into Claire's eyes. He knew this didn't fix everything. The logistics empire was still a mess. He was still a blue-collar mechanic with grease permanently tattooed into his skin, and she was still a billionaire with a target on her back. The world outside this garage would never understand the geometry of their lives. But as Claire rested her head against his chest, listening to the heavy, steady rhythm of his heart, Dean realized he didn't care. The engine was running. The chassis was solid. They could rebuild the rest together. Did Dean and Claire's journey of survival, grit, and unexpected love strike a chord with you? The greatest stories aren't found in boardrooms. They are forged in the hardest moments of our lives, when pride is stripped away and all that remains is the raw truth. If you loved this deep dive into the messy, beautiful reality of a single father and a fierce CEO finding alignment, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that hope is real, and subscribe for more grounded, emotional storytelling. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment?